They actually called the cops to bar my family from stepping foot in our own home. Yes. With burgers sizzling on the grill and flowers blooming in the yard, we somehow turned into the neighborhood's most wanted. Marched up to the officers, claiming we were illegally squatting in the house. My grandmother left me her real beef. My daughter playing outside. My dad dropping by, us daring to live without her say-so. But here's the kicker. This family doesn't roll over. Ever faced an HOA that thinks it trumps family, reality, and a shred of common sense? Drop your wild story in the comments, because this tale is about to get crazy. Kate and I had just relocated to Maple Ridge from Colorado, settling into the stunning home my grandmother bequeathed me. Nestled among 45 gorgeous houses with timeless architecture, ours boasted the biggest yard. Kate, a proud flower shop owner, wasted no time crafting a breathtaking garden corner, lavender roses swaying, paired with a handcrafted wooden welcome sign she'd poured her heart into. It was the kind of beauty that should have warmed any passerby's heart, but reasonable clearly wasn't in Patricia Williams' dictionary. Wielding a bright red clipboard, a laser measuring device, and a pro-grade camera that screamed private eye, dressed in a stark black suit, her high heels clicked across our driveway sharp kitchen window. What followed was the most over-the-top property inspection I'd ever seen. With her measuring our fence like an FBI bomb tech and circling our lavender bushes as if building a case for the crime of the century. File 43.5 in violation. Evidence of some international conspiracy. But the real kicker came when she marched right up to our welcome garden sign and just removed it, ripped it right out of. Seriously, Sophie, my 8-year-old daughter came running outside and asked the most innocent question. Even my 8-year-old could sense something was off about this woman. Kate came out with her watering can, trying to be neighborly. Despite the obvious weirdness of the situation, "Do you need help with something?" she asked politely. Patty's response was ice cold. "I'm helping you comply with the law." Then came the moment that really set the tone for everything that followed. Patty presented us with a list of 8. Too tall. Kate's lavender was causing allergic reactions, though she provided no evidence of anyone actually being allergic. My barbecue grill was unregistered. Apparently, we needed permits for cooking equipment. Now the welcome garden sign required proper licensing that we obviously didn't have, and my father's car, which had been parked in our driveway overnight when he visited, was somehow a violation because he didn't have a visitor sticker. The whole thing felt like I was back in my teaching days, dealing with that one student. Except this time, I was the target instead of the teacher trying to maintain classroom order. Kate was clearly angry, but trying to keep composure for Sophie's sake, while our daughter watched everything with those sharp, observant eyes that kids have when adults are acting strange around them. Then Patty delivered what she clearly thought was her knockout punch. She slapped this bright yellow violation notice right on our front door, like we were some kind of condemned property. Serious violations, 72 hours to comply or face legal consequences, it read in bold, threatening letters. She smiled with the kind of cold satisfaction that you see in people who genuinely enjoy having power over others, and said, "Welcome to Maple Ridge. I hope this family learns how to respect the rules." As she clicked away in those ridiculous heels, Mrs. Betty Jones emerged from her house across the street. Betty was this sweet. You instantly trust her. She walked over with this concerned expression and said something that made my blood run cold. Gavin, you need to know she's done this exact same thing too for other families. We were dealing with someone who had turned terrorizing her neighbors into a systematic campaign. 3 days later, I found myself sitting in the Maple Ridge Community Center, surrounded by 25 of my neighbors, watching Patricia Williams conduct what she clearly believed was the most important presentation of her career. She stood behind that screamed, "Look at me," with a massive screen behind her, displaying a slideshow titled Protecting Property Values Initiative. She held a laser pointer like a college professor about to deliver a lecture on quantum physics, except her subject. Fake charts, low lighting photos, and headlines big as documentary film titles. Our beautiful lavender and roses were presented like evidence in a terrorism investigation, complete with dramatic red arrows pointing at Kate's flowers and made-up statistics about property value decline that would have impressed a Hollywood special effects team. The level of creative fiction required to turn a suburban flower garden into a neighborhood crisis was honestly breathtaking in its audacity. I stood up to address what I thought was a reasonable. We could work something out like rational adults. Is there any way we can resolve this? I asked, hoping for some kind of compromise. That was my first mistake, assuming rationality had any place in Patricia. You think the rules don't apply to you? This isn't Colorado anymore. This is my Maple Ridge. The way she emphasized my sent a chill through the room that you could practically feel. This wasn't about property values or community standards. This was about control, pure and simple. She had turned our neighborhood into her personal kingdom, and she was making sure everyone understood who wore the crown. What happened next revealed just how deep her influence ran in our community. 15 out of 25 neighbors voted to support her position, but not because they necessarily agreed with her. You could see it in their faces, this mixture of fear and resignation that told the real story. Mrs. Jones tried to stand up for us. Bless her heart, Patty. This family just wants to live peacefully, she said, with the kind of gentle firmness that comes. Immediately, Mrs. Jones, you don't understand the importance of maintaining high standards. Then another neighbor, a man I didn't recognize, stood up and declared. But I caught the way Mrs. Jones glared at him, and I realized that even the people supporting Patty might be doing so out of fear rather than conviction. The whole experience reminded me of my worst days as a teacher, when you'd get that one student who turned the entire classroom dynamic toxic. Except this time, I was the one being targeted. Instead of trying to manage the situation, Kate sat beside me, gripping my hand under the table so tightly that I could feel her anger and frustration radiating through her fingers. Sophie watched the big screen with wide eyes, and I could tell she was starting to understand that the mean lady from our front yard was trying to hurt our family in front of all these people. But then Patty delivered the line that would haunt me for weeks, and in hindsight, sealed her own fate in ways she never could have imagined. She concluded her presentation by pointing that laser directly at me again and declaring with absolute confidence, if this family refuses to comply, I will send a report to the county court. If necessary, I will let a real judge deal with him. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. She was threatening to involve a real judge while talking to the son of the county's most respected judge, though of course she had no idea about my family connection. I sat there in complete Shock, not because of the threat itself, but because of how perfectly she had set up her own downfall without realizing it. The woman who was demanding that a real judge handle our case had no idea that she was about to get exactly what she was asking for, just not in the way she expected. When we got home that evening, I discovered something that made the whole situation even more disturbing. Our mailbox had been tampered with, and inside was an envelope with no return address containing a handwritten note that read, "Advice from a neighbor, be careful, she's watching families 24/7. The fact that someone felt the need to warn us anonymously told me everything I needed to know about the climate of fear that Patty had created in our neighborhood. As I stood there reading that note, I looked up toward Patty's house and saw a camera flash from her second-story window. She wasn't just making threats, she was actively stalking us, documenting our every move, like some kind of private investigator building a case. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with an overzealous HOA president. We were dealing with someone who had completely lost touch with the boundaries of normal human behavior. The next morning brought a whole new level of crazy that I honestly hadn't thought was possible. I walked outside to get the newspaper and immediately noticed a small surveillance camera mounted on the utility pole aimed directly at our yard. When I looked up at it, I heard the unmistakable click of a camera shutter from Patty's second-story window. She wasn't even trying to hide her surveillance operation anymore. She was flaunting it like some kind of badge of honor. But the real shock came when I opened our mailbox and found an unmarked envelope containing what appeared to be an official-looking note, HOA advisory. This family requires special monitoring. The casual way she had turned stalking into what she presented as legitimate HOA business was both terrifying and absurd. It was like watching someone slowly lose their grip on reality while maintaining absolute confidence in their authority. That's when Deputy Carson showed up for the first time, and I got my first real glimpse into how Patty had managed to turn our local law enforcement into her personal enforcement army. Carson wasn't a bad guy, he was just a cop trying to do his job based on the information he'd been given. Unfortunately, the information he'd been given came entirely from Patricia Williams, which meant it bore about as much resemblance to reality as her property value. Charles Carson approached my barbecue grill like it was a biological weapon. "Do you have registration for this under Regulation 23C?" he asked with complete seriousness. It sounded like he was talking about an intercontinental ballistic missile instead of a backyard cooking device. When Kate came outside carrying a basket of fresh flowers from her garden and offered Carson some lavender, saying it was very calming, his response was to look at her with genuine suspicion and ask, "Ma'am, is this a controlled substance?" The idea that my wife was potentially dealing drugs through her flower shop was so ridiculous that I almost started laughing, but Carson's expression told me he was completely serious. That's when I realized that Patty had managed to create an entire alternate reality where normal activities like grilling hamburgers and growing flowers were treated as potential criminal enterprises. She had fed Carson and probably other local officials such a steady diet of manufactured crises that they were approaching our family like we were some kind of domestic terrorist cell operating out of suburbia. But I wasn't completely helpless. My years as a teacher had taught me to document everything when dealing with unreasonable people, so I had started recording our conversations on my phone. What I discovered was that Carson was essentially operating based on email requests from the OHO. rather than any actual legal violations. He was just doing what he thought was his job, but his job had been defined by Patricia Williams, rather than actual law enforcement protocols. That's when Mrs. Jones appeared with a stack of papers that changed everything. "Gavin," she said, "I have email chains that prove Patty has been changing HOA rules without any community votes." She had been quietly documenting Patty's abuses for months, collecting evidence that showed a pattern of manufactured authority and systematic harassment. The third escalation came when Patty decided that having someone help us was unacceptable. Patty posted no visitor signs, like we were in a biological quarantine zone, and hired security guards to enforce it, turning our house into a sealed military base under lockdown. The absurdity of needing armed security to protect a suburban neighborhood from people visiting their own families would have been comedy gold if it weren't happening to us. The security guard was this poor guy who was just trying to earn a paycheck, but he had been told that our house was some kind of security risk. When my father showed up for what should have been a normal family visit, the guard actually stopped him and said, "Sir, no visitors are permitted." Dad, being the patient man he is, calmly explained, "I'm just here to visit my son." But the guard, following his instructions to the letter, replied, "I'm sorry, sir, rules are rules." That conversation became the moment when everything changed, though none of us realized it at the time. My father, Judge William Morrison, one of the most respected jurists in Orange County, stood there being told he couldn't visit his own son by a security guard who was following orders from a woman who had appointed herself as the supreme authority of our neighborhood. The irony was perfect. Patty had just picked a fight with the one person in the county who actually had the legal authority to shut down her entire operation. When I called Dad that evening to apologize for the embarrassment, his response was calm but carried an undertone that I recognized from my childhood. The voice he used when someone had pushed things too far. "Son," he said, "I need you to tell me exactly what's been happening. I need every detail." For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I felt like we might actually have a way to fight back. The chapter ended with Patty's biggest mistake yet. She called Deputy Carson, and not realizing that I had started recording everything, left a message that I captured on my phone. "I need you at the meeting tomorrow. There might be a need for strong intervention." She wasn't just harassing us anymore. She was planning to escalate to the point where she'd need police backup to handle a family barbecue. What she didn't know was that her strong intervention was about to meet the real definition of legal authority. Dad didn't just investigate Patricia Williams. He conducted the kind of thorough background check that only someone with 25 years of judicial experience knows how to do. What he discovered was a pattern that went way beyond simple HOA overreach. Patty had systematically driven for other families out of Maple Ridge using identical tactics: manufactured violations, escalating fines, surveillance, and intimidation campaigns that made normal family life impossible. The most disturbing part was how organized her operation had become. Dad found records showing that she had unilaterally changed HOA without community votes, created entirely fictional regulations that she presented as official rules, and had been using HO funds to pay for her personal legal expenses and bonuses for board members who supported her power grabs. She had essentially turned our neighborhood association into her personal dictatorship, complete with financial corruption and systematic abuse of anyone who questioned her authority. We spent an evening in my garage, spreading out a map of Maple Ridge and marking houses with red pen. The map was covered with red marks for families had been turned into victims of the same copy-paste harassment script. Too many cars in the driveway, lawn maintenance issues, children's noise violations, and unauthorized decorative elements. She had transformed each family into casualties of her manufactured authority, using reasons that sounded official but were completely fabricated. Looking at that map with those red marks scattered across our neighborhood like battle casualties made me realize that we weren't dealing with an overzealous volunteer. We were dealing with someone who had turned harassment into a systematic campaign of community destruction. Each of those red marks represented a family that had been forced to abandon their home because one person had decided they didn't belong in her neighborhood. But Dad's investigation revealed something even more significant. Patty had been using fear to control not just the families she targeted, but the entire community. The neighbors who voted to support her weren't necessarily agreeing with her methods. They were terrified of becoming her next victims. She had created a climate where standing up to her meant risking your own home and family's peace. So people went along with her demands rather than face the consequences of resistance. Several neighbors told my dad in quiet backdoor conversations that they had stopped attending HOA meetings altogether just to avoid being seen as potential rebels. One woman, a single mom with 2 kids, admitted she only parked on her lawn because Patty fined her 3 times for inconsistent driveway usage. A retired couple said they stopped inviting their grandkids over on weekends because Patty warned them about unsupervised juvenile activity. These weren't violations. They were scare tactics, and they had worked. It wasn't just the homes marked on the map that had been affected. It was the entire neighborhood that had been living under an invisible fog of fear and obedience, waiting for the next accusation. The 4th escalation came when Patty discovered that I had hired a lawyer, though, of course, she had no idea that the lawyer was my father, one of the most powerful judges in the county. Her response was to double down on the visitor restrictions, installing not just signs, but actual security patrols, and threatening legal action against anyone who came to our house without her explicit permission. She was essentially trying to place our family under house arrest in our own neighborhood. The security situation reached peak absurdity when Dad showed up for what should have been a normal Sunday dinner. The guard approached him with this apologetic but firm demeanor and said, "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification and verify your visit with the HOA." Dad, maintaining the kind of patience that comes from decades of dealing with courtroom drama, replied calmly, "I'm here to have dinner with my son's family." But the guard, following Patty's increasingly paranoid instructions, insisted, "I understand, sir, but I have to follow protocols." What Patty didn't realize was that every interaction, every escalation, every abuse of power was being documented by someone who understood exactly how to build a legal case. Dad wasn't just collecting evidence, he was preparing for the kind of comprehensive legal response that would shut down her operation permanently. He had discovered that her behavior wasn't just annoying or inappropriate, it was actually illegal under several state and federal laws governing harassment, stalking, and civil rights violations. The breakthrough moment came when I suggested recording the next HOA meeting. Dad, I said, "I think we should document the next meeting so people can see what's really happening." His response was immediate and decisive. Excellent idea. Transparency is the foundation of justice. But what I didn't know was that Dad had already been planning something much more dramatic than simple documentation. That's when he told me about Patty's biggest legal vulnerability, her systematic violation of proper HOA procedures. She had been operating under rules that she had created herself without community input or legal authority. Everything she had done to our family and the other victims was based on fictional regulations that had no legal standing whatsoever. She had essentially been running an elaborate confidence game, using people's assumption that HOA rules were legitimate to justify behavior that was actually criminal harassment. The chapter reached its climax when Patty made her next fatal mistake. She called Deputy Carson and scheduled what she described as an emergency meeting to vote for our permanent banishment from the neighborhood. She had prepared what she called legal documents to formalize our expulsion, and she wanted police backup in case we caused trouble during the proceedings. What she was planning was essentially a kangaroo court with herself as judge, jury, and executioner. But she made one crucial error in that phone call. She said, "I need you there tomorrow for strong intervention," not realizing that I had started recording all communications related to our situation. When Dad heard that recording, his expression changed in a way that I recognized from childhood. The look he got when someone had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "will be the last day she serves as HOA president." He was no longer just investigating Patricia Williams. He was preparing to end her reign of terror once and for all. The morning of Patty's emergency meeting started with what I can only describe as the most adorable act of rebellion in suburban history. Sophie had been quietly observing everything that was happening to our family, and she decided to express her feelings through art. She created this amazing drawing of Patricia Williams as a classic fairy tale, which, complete with a pointed hat, an evil grin, and a broomstick, and she hung it on her front door like a tiny declaration of war. Kate found it first and started laughing despite everything we were going through. "Honey," she called to Sophie, "maybe we shouldn't hang this where everyone can see it." But Sophie, with the absolute conviction that only 8-year-olds can muster, replied, "But Mom, she really is mean to Daddy sometimes. Children see the truth more clearly than adults, who get caught up in trying to be diplomatic about people who don't deserve diplomacy." But Patty's final assault was already in motion, and it was bigger than anything she had attempted before. She had spent the previous week building what she believed was an airtight case for our permanent removal from the neighborhood. Fake emails, fabricated witness statements, even photos of broken flower pots. Patty had constructed an entire crime novel, with our house cast as the villain. The woman who couldn't stand the sight of our lavender had somehow managed to make us look like a suburban crime syndicate operating out of a garden center. When Deputy Carson showed up with what he described as an investigation warrant, I realized that Patty had managed to convince local law enforcement that we were actually dangerous. Carson wasn't being malicious. He genuinely believed he was responding to a legitimate threat. Based on the mountain of fabricated evidence that Patty had provided, the whole situation had escalated from annoying HOA disputes to potential criminal charges based entirely on one woman's ability to manufacture reality. That's when Kate showed exactly why I married her. As Carson prepared to escort me away for questioning, she stepped directly between us and said, With absolute clarity, Officer Carson, no one is taking my husband anywhere for grilling hamburgers and growing lavender. Show me the real evidence. Her voice carried the kind of authority that comes from knowing absolutely that you're in the right. And for the first time, Carson hesitated in that moment, looking at her, shielding me with nothing but her voice and conviction. I remembered why I had fallen in love with her in the first place. Kate didn't just believe in flowers and community. She believed in standing firm when it mattered, and now she was doing it not with protest signs, but with love and spine. Carson might have had a badge, but Kate had something better, moral clarity. It disarmed him more effectively than any argument. I could have made Sophie's reaction broke my heart and made me proud at the same time. She wrapped her arms around my leg and declared, "Daddy didn't do anything wrong," with the kind of fierce loyalty that kids show when they see their parents being threatened. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about HOA rules or neighborhood politics anymore. This was about whether we were going to let one person's need for control destroy our family's sense of safety and belonging in our own home. That's when Mrs. Jones emerged as our unlikely hero. She didn't just bring video evidence, she brought printed email chains, proof of everything Patty had been doing for months. Her evidence showed that Patty had been systematically modifying HOA rules without community votes, destroying permit applications from other residents, and even recording private conversations, where she admitted to planning the destruction of families who didn't submit to her authority. The most damning piece of evidence was plus security camera footage that Mrs. Jones had been collecting for weeks. It showed Patty sneaking into the yards of 3 other families to plant fake violations, placing unauthorized decorations that she could then discover and use as justification for fines and harassment. She had been literally framing her neighbors for violations that she herself had created, then using those fake violations to justify escalating persecution campaigns. But the moment that changed everything was when Carson actually looked at the evidence. Mrs. Jones provided you could see the realization dawning on his face that he had been manipulated into participating in a systematic harassment campaign. He radioed dispatch and said, "Cancel that warrant. We have a situation here that needs different handling." For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt like someone in authority was actually seeing the truth of what was happening to us. That's when I made the call that I should have made weeks earlier. "Dad," I said, "I can't handle this by myself anymore." His response was immediate and reassuring. "Son, you don't need to handle it by yourself. I'm on my way." But what I didn't know was that Dad was already in motion. Having left the courthouse, still wearing his judicial robes, bringing with him the full authority of his office and 25 years of experience dealing with people who thought they were above the law, the chapter ended with perfect dramatic timing. Just as Patty was declaring victory to the small crowd that had gathered to watch our removal, Dad's car pulled up to our house. He stepped out wearing his full judicial robes, carrying his official briefcase, and looking every inch the federal authority that Patty had been pretending to represent. The expression on her face when she saw him was worth every moment of harassment we had endured. Pure shock, mixed with the dawning realization that she might have finally picked a fight with someone who actually had the power to fight back. Patricia Williams had transformed the Maple Ridge Community Center into her personal courthouse fantasy. Patty had dressed up as a judge, like a child actor auditioning for a talent show. Toy wooden gavel cosplay robes, and a jury box filled with terrified neighbors who looked like They'd rather be anywhere else on earth. She had set up a defendant's chair, positioned directly in front of her makeshift bench, clearly intended for me to sit in while she conducted her amateur theater production, masquerading as legal proceedings. She began her proceedings with the kind of pompous formality that people use when they're trying to sound important. Today, we gather to determine the fate of a family that has consistently disrupted the peaceful harmony of our community. The way she banged that gavel and gestured with her fake authority would have been hilarious if she weren't trying to destroy our lives. Mr. Gavin Morrison, she continued, you stand accused of willful violations of community standards, aggressive behavior toward residents, and general disregard for the welfare of your neighbors. But then something happened that Patricia Williams had clearly not anticipated in any of her elaborate planning. The door opened and my father walked in wearing his actual judicial robes, carrying his official court briefcase, and radiating the kind of quiet authority that comes from 25 years of presiding over real legal proceeding. The entire room fell silent in a way that was almost physical. You could literally feel the energy change as everyone realized that actual legal authority had just entered Patty's pretend courtroom. Dad surveyed the scene with the kind of calm assessment that judges use when they're trying to understand what exactly is happening. In their courtroom, I heard there was a trial taking place here, he said, in that measured tone that all experienced judges develop, but I don't see any actual legal authority. Present the contrast between his genuine judicial presence and Patty's costume party version of legal proceedings was so stark that it made her entire operation look like a child playing dress-up. Patty's response was everything I had hoped it would be, and more. She started stammering, clearly trying to process what was happening. Who are you? The woman who had been so confident in her authority just moments before was suddenly face to face with someone who actually possessed the legal power she had been pretending to wield. Judge William Morrison, Orange County Superior Court. Dad replied with the kind of calm precision that courtroom professionals use when establishing their credentials, and the man you're attempting to put on trial. Here is my son. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. The neighbors who had been sitting in Patty's fake jury box suddenly looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs. But Patty, to her credit or detriment, depending on how you look at it, wasn't ready to give up her fantasy just yet. That's impossible, she declared. Gavin can't have a father who's a judge. The desperation in her voice was almost painful. To hear this was a woman whose entire sense of power and control was crumbling in real time, and she was clinging to denial like a life preserver. Dad's response was perfect. You're absolutely right about one thing, Patricia. This isn't a real trial, but since you seem so interested in legal proceedings, let me show you what actual judicial authority looks like. He opened his briefcase and began removing official court documents, evidence folders, and legal papers that represented weeks of proper investigation and documentation. The moment when Dad demanded to see Patty's official HOA bylaws was when her entire house of cards finally collapsed. She handed over her rulebook with shaking hands, and Dad immediately identified the sections where she had taped additional rules onto the original pages, modifications that had never been voted on by the community and had no legal standing whatsoever. These changes were never approved by the residents, he observed. You've been enforcing non-existent regulations and using them to harass innocent families. A murmur rippled through the room as neighbors leaned forward, reading the marked-up pages. Dad held, you could see the realization. Hitting them all, the tickets, fines, and fear they'd endured were based on lies taped into a binder. One man whispered, "She'll find me $500 for a rule that doesn't even exist." A younger woman gasped, "She told me it was state law." The illusion of authority Patty had spent years crafting was disintegrating in real time, replaced by a collective anger that had been waiting far too long to surface. Watching Patricia Williams' confident facade crumble was like watching a building demolition in slow motion. Her hands started shaking, her voice began quavering, and for the first time since I'd met her, she seemed to realize that she wasn't the most powerful person in the room. I was just protecting property values," she whispered, as if saying it quietly would somehow make it more reasonable. Bad's response was delivered with the kind of judicial authority that ends arguments permanently. "What you were doing, Patricia, was systematically harassing your neighbors, falsifying official documents, and violating multiple state and federal laws regarding civil rights and personal liberty. Your actions constitute criminal behavior under several statutes, and they end." Today, the chapter concluded with Deputy Carson stepping forward to address Dad directly. "Judge Morrison," he said, "I owe you and your family an apology. I was acting on information that I now realize was completely fabricated." Carson's willingness to admit his mistake and realign with actual legal authority marked the moment when Patty's web of manipulation finally broke apart completely. But Dad wasn't finished yet. He picked up the nameplate that read HOA President from Patty's fake bench and placed it in front of me. "There will be new leadership in this community," he announced, "but first we need to address the issue of ensuring that no family ever faces this kind of harassment again." The look on Patty's face told me that she was beginning to understand that her reign of terror wasn't just ending, it was about to be replaced by actual consequences for everything she had done. The restraining order that Dad issued wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a masterpiece of legal precision that effectively ended in our neighborhood ever again. Perfect, the woman who had tried to control everyone else's access to their own property was now legally prohibited from accessing hers. Watching Patty discover the practical implications of the restraining order provided some of the most satisfying moments of this entire ordeal. Her usual 2-minute drive home routes and the expression on her face, pure frustration mixed with disbelief that her own tactics were being used against her, was worth every moment of harassment we had endured. The Farrell sign appeared in front of Patty's house within 48 hours of the restraining order being issued. She didn't have any choice in the matter. And criminal charges, the woman who had driven 4 other families out of the neighborhood, was now packing her own belongings under the watchful eyes of the same neighbors she had spent months terrorizing. The moving truck situation provided the final touch of perfect irony that this story deserved. Patty's moving truck blocked the street for an entire afternoon, a clear violation of the very traffic regulations she had used to harass other families. But instead of calling the HOA to complain, everyone just quietly went about their business, because we all wanted her gone more than we wanted to enforce the petty rules she had created. The symbolism was beautiful. Her departure violated her own regulations, but nobody cared because the regulations themselves had been the real problem all along. As word spread about Patty's departure, neighbors began emerging from their houses, like people stepping out after a long storm, had finally passed, Mrs. Cindy from 2 houses down approached me with tears in her eyes and said, for the first time in 3 years, "I can play music in my garden without being afraid." An elderly gentleman named Frank, who lived on the corner, told me, "I planted a memorial rose bush for my late wife, but Patty made me remove it this weekend. I'm putting it back where it belongs." These weren't just stories about flowers and music. They were stories about people reclaiming their right to feel at home in their own neighborhood. My inauguration as the new HOA president was everything that Patty's fake trial had pretended to be: a genuine community gathering focused on actual problem solving rather than power games. Kate stood beside me with a bouquet of flowers from our expanded garden, which now included not just lavender and roses, but also the unauthorized plants that several other families had started growing in solidarity with our situation. The message was clear. We were moving from a neighborhood from our neighbors. Kate decided to expand her flower business right from our home. She created a small corner in our front yard where people could stop by to purchase flowers, herbs, and plants. Who had won back their freedom to make their homes truly their own? The little hand-painted sign she made became a symbol of everything our neighborhood had fought for and achieved together: the common-sense code that Kate and I developed to replace Patty's manufactured regulations was intentionally simple and focused on actual community welfare rather than control mechanisms. Rule 1: be kind to your neighbors. Rule 2: respect personal property. Rule 3: community cooperation over individual control. Rule 4: common sense prevails over technicalities. The visual transformation of Maple Ridge over the following months was remarkable. The old HOA sign, "Maple, welcome home, respect over rules," barbecue grills appeared in yards throughout the neighborhood as families realized they were free to use their own property without fear of persecution. Gardens bloomed with previously unauthorized flowers as people discovered the joy of personalizing their homes. Children played outside without the constant worry that their normal activities might somehow violate Patty's ever-changing regulations, without fear of being cited for excessive noise levels above 65 dB. She said, "This feels like our real home now, doesn't it?" That simple observation from my 8-year-old daughter captured exactly what we had all been fighting for: the right to feel genuinely at home in our own/neighborhood. Patricia Williams' new life provided the final chapter of poetic justice that this story required. 3 months after her forced departure from Maple Ridge, I received an email from the Willowbrook Heights HOA. "We heard about your experience with Patricia Williams. She just moved into our neighborhood and is trying to become our HOA president. Do you have any advice?" My response was immediate and simple: call Judge Morrison. He specializes in HOA reform and community protection. Trust me on this one. The email exchange that followed was deeply satisfying. Within a week, I received a follow-up message: "Thank you so much for the referral, Judge. Previous activities, her application for HOA leadership has been permanently rejected, and we've implemented new safeguards to prevent this kind of situation from developing in our community." Patty's reputation had followed her, and her ability to recreate her reign of terror. Patty's house was sold. The neighbors organized a community barbecue, the first one in years. It wasn't official, no agenda, no rules, just tables of food, kids running around, dogs playing, and people rediscovering what it meant to be a neighbor. Frank brought his wife's rosebush in a wheelbarrow and planted it. Beside the picnic table, Cindy played music from a Bluetooth speaker, something she hadn't done since 2019. Kate handed out lavender bundles as thank you gifts. We didn't need a speech. That day, the grill smoked the laughter. It was finally home. The final scene of our story took place on a perfect Sunday afternoon, 6 months after Patty's departure. I was grilling hamburgers in our backyard, the same activity that had started this entire conflict, while Kate tended to our expanded garden and Sophie played with neighborhood children who were no longer afraid to make noise while having fun. Dad sat on our porch, reading the newspaper in casual clothes, having traded his judicial robes for the simple pleasure of being a grandfather, visiting his family without restrictions or harassment. The contrast with how our neighborhood had functioned under Patty's control was striking and beautiful. Instead of surveillance cameras and nose signs, we had welcome mats and open doors. Instead of fearful neighbors avoiding eye contact, we had community barbecues and spontaneous gatherings. Instead of manufactured crises and artificial emergencies, we had the peaceful rhythms of normal family life in a supportive community. As I stood there, flipping those hamburgers, the same ones that had somehow been classified as a community threat just months before, I reflected on what we had learned from this experience. Sometimes the people who hide behind rules and regulations are the ones who most need to be held accountable to actual laws and genuine community standards. Sometimes the bullies who use official-sounding language and manufactured authority are the most vulnerable when confronted with real legal power and authentic community leadership. But most importantly, we learned that standing up to systematic harassment and abuse requires more than just individual resistance. It requires community support, proper documentation, and sometimes the intervention of people who have the actual authority to stop injustice when it's happening. My father's position as a judge gave us access to legal remedies that other families might not have, but the principles we used, documentation, community, organizing, and persistence in the face of intimidation, are available to anyone facing similar situations. The story ends where it began, with a family grilling hamburgers in their own backyard, growing flowers in their own garden, and living peacefully in their own home. But now we do it with the knowledge that our community supports us. Our rights are protected by law, and bullies like Patricia Williams can't use fake authority to destroy families who just want to live their lives in peace. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it arrives, it's worth the wait from all of us.